on slide 37. We've gone through, and I would say, and I'll just ballpark figure it, about 10, 15 slides that longevity is included within it. And then when we get to 37, you chose not to include longevity.
That's correct.
Okay. So when we're looking at a comparable of correction officers with Capitol Police, Park Rangers, State Police, AFSCME, game officers, not only is there not longevity in there, but then there's also some lump sum payments, as you indicate, that are also not included, correct?
That's correct.
So the game officers, if you added the lump sum payment, would go slightly above the 11.7.
During the 1 year in which they received the lump sum,
all right.
Not in terms of the change in their pay. Same would be true for AFSCME if we had a lump sum in that period. It's part of compensation. We noted it, but it's not growth in their pay.
The same thing would be in effect for the AFSCME pay increase. Potentially you have a 17.6 pay increase, but if you added a lump sum payment, that's additional compensation that an AFSCME member received, correct?
For that year, yes.
Okay. Now, when you look at the CPI information that you provided, Dr. McCarthy presented the CPI over a roughly 8-year period, right?
That sounds right.
Right. And over that 8-year period, whether you look at it the way Dr. McCarthy looked at it or whether you looked at it the way that you presented in slide 35, you're pretty close to the CPI under both, right?
Without accounting for longevity increments or step increments, just the GPIs, yes, by either measure, it's relatively close during that period, which included, as we talked about this morning, a disproportionate number of rough budget years. And they still, by either measure, were a little ahead or very close.
Okay. Now, on this previous slide, you chose to even further narrow the time frame, and you chose to compare it in a 3-year period. Is that correct?
In the first slide, we looked at the contract period, the most recent contract period.
Okay. And the CPI over the last 3 years has been lower than it has in recent years. Was that over the last 10 years?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
That's fair. It actually went down for some portion of that period.
Right. Now, one of the things you said initially is that or maybe not initially, during your presentation, you stated that there is no exact fit when you do these comparables. Is that correct?
In terms of state-to-state comparisons or employer-to-employer comparisons?
Either one.
Yes.
So when the Board of Arbitration looks at these comparables, there's no scientific formula that they could plug in a wage increase and say, yes, this fits the formula.
I would agree with that. I think it can be a helpful reference point. It can help to identify if a particular bargaining unit is an outlier. It can give you a feel for relative position. But no, I don't think there's a black box formula that will spit out the right answer in terms of what adjustments, if any, should be made.
Okay, and people can differ on it. For example, you are of the opinion that, for example, Virginia was a state that should have been used, correct? Or a state that you used?
I think it's a relevant point of reference.
Okay. And versus Dr. McCarthy, who was presented and accepted as an expert in the field also, she didn't believe Virginia was appropriate. So you would agree that you differed in that regard?
I might infer that. I don't know that she was asked about Virginia specifically, but based on what I had seen of Dr. McCarthy's approach, I would expect she would differ.
And the same thing may, for example, would be in effect for West Virginia. You chose to use West Virginia. Dr. McCarthy did not. Dr. McCarthy did not use West Virginia. So for some reason, you also differed in regard to that.
That may be. Again, I don't know. I can't speak to her approach with certainty. I think West Virginia, to me, provides a good example of how context is important in making sense of these different comparability references. In other words, West Virginia, by almost any measure, has weaker resources than Pennsylvania. Income levels are lower, housing costs are lower, credit ratings are lower. You would expect them, all other things being equal, and there may be other factors, you would expect them to pay less than Pennsylvania for similar jobs, and they do. By the same token, our income levels, wealth levels, housing costs are significantly lower than states like New Jersey and New York that Dr. McCarthy and I both included. And by the same reasoning, all other things being equal, and they aren't always in year to year, but all other things being equal, I would expect New York and New Jersey would generally pay better than us, and they do. So I find, whether or not West Virginia is a close cousin to Pennsylvania, it is a bordering state and provides a frame of reference that I think is helpful in triangulating to assess whether or not pay here is competitive.
Now, one of the other states that you used was Delaware that Dr. McCarthy didn't use, correct?
That's correct.
And we can agree whether or not you would disagree with Dr. McCarthy or even myself in formulating an opinion that perhaps Delaware, West Virginia, and Virginia is not a comparable state, you would at least agree with the fact that all three of them, Delaware, Virginia, and West Virginia, pay less than Pennsylvania for COs.
Yes, we do.
All right. That's all I have.
Any questions from the panel?
Shockingly, I have a couple.
Watch out, Mike, he gave me the microphone. I just have a few questions, and I don't want to hold you up. But when you were talking about the general labor market and the median earnings, does that include, and you're measuring, county residents, does that include those that are both employed and unemployed?
It's anyone with earnings.
Anyone with earnings. So even if you're making $10 a week?
Yes.
Okay. And I was a little bit confused about your rationale for the inclusion of Virginia and Michigan in the comparables. And I assume that the reason is because that's where we have inmates housed?
Michigan, again, would have been included based on the other criteria
Yeah.
anyway, but yes, that
Okay.
that was the rationale for
Okay. So,
looking at the practices in those states.
so my question is, if we ship these people to Guadalajara, Mexico, would Guadalajara be an appropriate comparable?
Well, to my knowledge, we don't. But I guess I'm hung up a little bit in answering that question, again, on this concept of appropriate comparable and what the definition of that would be. I think in the same way that there's no perfect twin for comparison, I don't know that comparables are appropriate or inappropriate. I think they are more or less relevant based on context. And you know, if at some point budget pressures require an organization to look at alternative ways of delivering their services, then the cost factors associated with alternative means of service delivery are going to become relevant. I don't think the Commonwealth is there now in terms of sending folks to south of the border.
Okay. And you'd mentioned, you know, how the Kaiser Family Foundation survey does their survey work, and you and I have discussed this on many occasions now. And you have agreed with me before, and I hope you will again, that public employers responding to the Kaiser Family Foundation survey, you only get about a 16% response rate.
Response rate, or make up that percentage of the overall?
A response rate. 16% of public employers respond to the Kaiser Family survey. Public employers, I should say. Sorry.
And forgive me, if what you're saying is that the figures reported in the Kaiser survey reflect practices in the public sector proportionate to the percent of the total workforce that the public sector represents, and if that's something around 16%, then that would be consistent with my understanding.
Okay.
If you're indicating that public employers don't answer the questions or don't respond to this particular survey, I don't know either way.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to go back, and I had a couple questions on some of the slides, and they're just to clear up some questions in my mind. On slide 7, you had a head count of CO1s, CO2s, CO3s, CO4s, CO5s.
I'm sorry.
You had a head count of corrections officers.
On which slide?
Slide 7, I'm sorry.
7, okay, I thought you said slide 5. Yep.
Okay. Now, obviously, and I came up with a number of about 9,100 if you add those all up. And obviously, we've got a lot more than 9,100 people in this unit. You just took corrections officers. You didn't look at like food service instructors or CC monitors or labor foremen or anything like that.
On slide 7.
On slide 7.
That's correct. The focus here was on
The bulk.
the most prevalent
Okay.
career series that this bargaining unit, of which this bargaining unit represents a lot of folks, yeah, but
Sure.
it doesn't go beyond that.
All right, and what I'm looking at is with respect to CO2s, which is the highest you can go in this bargaining unit, we're talking about maybe about 15% of the unit can actually get promoted to CO2?
I'm hesitating because I'm not, I think that's about the rough percentage.
Yeah, I'm not good with math.
Unit that they represent today, but for individuals entering this series who stay with the Commonwealth, there's probably a greater than 15% chance they could move up to that level, because there are a whole bunch of folks in the earlier years of their career who just aren't eligible yet. But you know, by the time you get, the sort of general point of this slide is simply, you know, when Dr. McCarthy or I present these 20, 25, 30